On the evening of September 14, 1971, a man named Yuen Wah Kung was carrying a tray of hot chrysanthemum tea through the narrow aisle of a restaurant on Granville Road, Kowloon. His hands were shaking, not from the weight of the tray, not from exhaustion, from something older, something buried under 12 years of silence. He was 51 years old, his knuckles were flat, his nose had been broken 4 times, and the last time he had thrown a punch, a man did not get back up. Yuen had been a boxer. Not the kind who trained in clean gyms with padded floors, the kind who fought in warehouses along the Yuen Wah docks in the late 1940s, where the ring was made of rope tied to oil drums and the crowd bet with cash wrapped in newspaper. He had 37 wins, 29 knockouts, 2 losses, and 1 night in 1958 that he never spoke about again. On that night, in a concrete basement underneath a tailor shop, Yuen hit a man named Fong Wai so hard that Fong's legs buckled sideways and his head struck the edge of a metal chair on the way down. Fong died 9 hours later at Queen Mary Hospital. The police never came. The fight had been off the books, but Yuen came. He came to the hospital, he sat in the hallway for 6 hours, and when the nurse told him Fong was gone, Yuen walked to the waterfront, removed his gloves, and dropped them into Victoria Harbour. He never fought again. He disappeared into restaurant kitchens, first as a dishwasher, then a busboy, then, by 1971, a waiter at the Hing Fat Noodle House, a place where the tables were sticky and the owner screamed orders and nobody noticed the quiet man with the flat knuckles pouring tea in the back. That night, September 14th, the restaurant was almost empty. A couple arguing near the window, an old man reading a racing form, and one man sitting alone at the corner table, wearing a plain black cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He had ordered wonton soup and a pot of jasmine tea. He ate slowly. He said nothing, but he watched everything. His eyes moved in a way Yuen recognized, not nervous, not distracted, scanning, the way a man watches a room when he has been watched by rooms his whole life. Yuen brought the tea. His foot caught the leg of a chair, the tray tilted, the pot slid, and before the tea could hit the table, the man in the black shirt caught it, not with urgency, not with panic, with one hand, without looking up, the way someone catches a set of keys tossed to them by a friend. The pot did not spill, the lid did not rattle. The man placed it gently back on the tray and said, in Cantonese, "No harm done." Yuen apologized 3 times, his face was red. The owner was already shouting from the kitchen, but the man at the table raised one hand barely above the surface and the gesture was so calm that Yuen stopped mid-sentence. "You are fine," the man said. "The tea is fine. Sit down for a second." Yuen did not sit. Waiters did not sit with customers, but something in the man's voice made him pause. The man looked at him, not at his apron, not at the tray, at his hands, specifically at his knuckles. "You used to fight," the man said. It was not a question. Yuen said nothing. "I can always tell," the man said. "The knuckles flatten a certain way. Only real contact does that. Bags don't do it. Wood doesn't do it. Bone does it." They exchanged no more than 40 seconds of conversation, but when Yuen brought the bill, there was a single folded banknote beneath the empty teacup, 100 Hong Kong dollars. In 1971, a waiter at the Hing Fat Noodle House earned approximately $11 a day. $100 was more than a week's wages. Yuen unfolded the bill and stared at it. He looked toward the door, but the man in the black shirt was already gone. Yuen did not know the man's name. He did not ask. He put the bill in his shirt pocket and worked the rest of his shift in silence. But that night, walking home through the wet streets of Tsim Sha Tsui, he felt something he had not felt in 13 years. He felt seen, not as a waiter, not as a failure, not as the man who killed Fong Wai in a basement, as a man who had once been something, and someone had noticed that someone was Bruce Lee. And in exactly 21 days, that $100 bill would become the most important tip ever left on a table in Hong Kong, not because of what it bought, but because of the chain of events it set into motion, a chain that would lead Yuen Wah Kung back into a room with violence, back into a moment where his hands would have to decide whether they still remembered what they had sworn to forget, and a chain that would place Bruce Lee's life in the hands of a man he had spoken to for less than a minute. But to understand how that night unfolded, you first need to understand what was happening to Bruce Lee in the autumn of 1971, because the most dangerous period of his life was not in a ring. It was not on a film set. It was in the space between his rising fame and the men who believed that fame belonged to them. By October 1971, Bruce Lee was the most talked-about man in Hong Kong. The Big Boss had opened in theaters on October 3rd and within 72 hours had shattered every box office record the territory had ever known. Lines wrapped around the Queensway Theatre before dawn. Scalpers sold tickets at 5 times their face value. Taxi drivers quoted his dialogue. Children threw sidekicks at lampposts on their way to school. The colony had never seen anything like it. But fame in Hong Kong in 1971 was not like fame anywhere else in the world. It moved through a system, and that system had owners. The film industry was controlled by a small network of men who operated at the intersection of entertainment and organized crime. Studio lots were built on land leased through triad-affiliated brokers. Distribution channels ran through companies with silent partners who never appeared on paper but always appeared at premieres. Actors who became too popular too quickly learned that popularity was a resource, and resources in Hong Kong were managed. Bruce Lee's problem was simple. He had become enormous overnight, and he had done it without permission. Raymond Chow, the head of Golden Harvest, had signed Bruce to a 2-picture deal worth $15,000 per film. At the time, it was generous, but the Big Boss earned more than $3.5 million in its theatrical run. The gap between what Bruce was paid and what he generated was so vast that it created a kind of gravitational distortion around him. Everyone wanted in, everyone wanted a piece, and the men who controlled the old system saw Bruce not as an artist but as an asset that had not yet been properly claimed. A man named Chung Yat Fai sat at the center of this system. He was not a gangster. That is important to understand. He was something more useful than a gangster. He was a bridge. He ran a company called Pacific Crown Holdings, which on paper was an import-export firm specializing in textiles and electronics. In practice, Pacific Crown facilitated relationships between the entertainment industry and the 14K Triad Society. Chung arranged financing for films. He brokered talent deals. He smoothed disputes between studios. And when a new star emerged who threatened to upset the balance of the existing order, Chung was the man who arranged the conversation. He had done it before. In 1968, when a young actor named Lung Fei had refused to appear in a series of low-budget action films for Shaw Brothers, Chung had invited Lung to a private dinner at a restaurant in Mong Kok. 3 days later, Lung signed the contract. No one ever asked what happened at that dinner. Lung never spoke of it, but colleagues noticed that he walked differently afterward. Something in his posture had changed. Now Chung turned his attention to Bruce Lee. The message arrived at Bruce's home on Cumberland Road in Kowloon Tong on the morning of October 2nd, 1 day before The Big Boss premiered. It was a red envelope, hand-delivered by a driver in a black Mercedes. Inside was a single card, handwritten in traditional Chinese characters. It read, "A man of your talent deserves friends who understand the full landscape. Dinner, October 4th. The Golden Peony, 3rd floor. Come alone." There was no signature. There did not need to be. Bruce had been in Hong Kong long enough to know what a red envelope delivered by a black Mercedes meant. He showed the card to no one, not to Linda, not to Raymond Chow, not to his assistant. He placed it in the drawer of his writing desk beneath a copy of Krishnamurti's The First and Last Freedom, and he did not look at it again until the morning of October 4th. What Bruce Lee did not know, what he could not have known, was that the dinner at the Golden Peony was not simply a meeting, it was an audition, and not for him. The audition was for the men in the room, to see whether Bruce Lee could be managed, whether he could be guided, whether he was the kind of man who understood that in Hong Kong even dragons fly within corridors. And what none of them knew, not Chung, not his men, not Bruce, was that the person who would determine the outcome of that evening was already inside the building. He was wearing a white shirt and black trousers. He was carrying a tray of glass teacups, and in his shirt pocket, folded into a square the size of a matchbox, was a $100 bill that he had not spent in 21 days, because Yuen Wah Kung had taken a second job, and his second job was at the Golden Peony. The Golden Peony sat on the 3rd floor of a narrow building on Sai Yung Choi Street in Mong Kok. The ground floor was a watch repair shop. The 2nd floor was empty. The 3rd floor was accessible only by a staircase at the rear of the building, past a steel door with no handle on the outside. You had to knock. Someone had to let you in. The restaurant had no sign. It was not listed in any directory. It served only private parties, and the parties were arranged by one man. Chung Yat-fai had used the Golden Peony for years. The kitchen was run by a chef named Leung, who had once cooked for a British admiral and who asked no questions about the guests. The dining room held a single long table covered in white linen, surrounded by 12 chairs upholstered in dark red leather. The lighting was low, amber-toned, supplied by wall-mounted brass fixtures that cast soft halos on the plaster. The windows were covered with heavy curtains. The room smelled of sandalwood incense and oyster sauce. On the evening of October 4th, Chung arrived at 7:15. He was accompanied by 5 men. 2 of them were associates from Pacific Crown. One was a man named Ko Wyman, who managed talent contracts for a production company linked to the Sun Yi-on triad. The 4th was a bodyguard, a thick-necked former police constable named Lam, who stood 6 feet tall and weighed approximately 230 pounds. The 5th was a man Bruce Lee had never seen before and would never see again, a slim, quiet figure in a grey suit who sat at the far end of the table and said nothing the entire evening. No one introduced him, no one addressed him. He simply watched. Chung wore a dark blue suit with no tie. His glasses were gold-rimmed. His hair was slicked back with precision. He was 53 years old, and he carried himself with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of knowing exactly how much power is in the room and exactly how much of it belongs to you. At 7:40, a knock came at the steel door. Yuen Wah Kung opened it. Bruce Lee stood in the narrow hallway, alone, wearing a white shirt and dark trousers. No jacket, no watch. His hair was slightly damp, as though he had recently showered. He looked at Yuen for a fraction of a second, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, not of a name, not of a history, but of the hands, the flat knuckles, the same man from the Hing Fat Noodle House. Bruce said nothing. He gave a small nod. Yuen stepped aside and Bruce walked into the room. The dinner began with courtesy. Chung stood, extended his hand, and greeted Bruce with the kind of warmth that is indistinguishable from choreography. He congratulated him on the big boss. He praised his speed, his screen presence, his ability to command an audience. He poured tea personally. He offered cigarettes, which Bruce declined. He asked about Linda, about the children, about the house on Cumberland Road. Bruce answered politely, briefly, and with a calm that Yuen, watching from the kitchen doorway, recognized as deliberate. Yuen served the first course, steamed garupa with ginger and scallion. He placed each plate with careful precision, and as he leaned between Bruce and the man to his left, he heard Bruce's breathing. It was slow, unnaturally slow, the kind of breathing Yuen had heard only in men who were controlling their pulse, men who knew something was about to happen and were already preparing for it. The conversation shifted during the second course. Chung removed his glasses, polished them with a silk cloth and set them on the table. That gesture, Yuen would learn later, was not casual. Chung always removed his glasses before delivering the part of the evening that mattered. "Bruce," Chung said, "you have achieved something remarkable, truly. But I want to speak to you honestly, because I respect you. What you have done with the big boss is extraordinary, but a single film is a spark. To build a fire, you need fuel, and fuel, in this industry, comes from relationships." Bruce listened. He did not interrupt. "Raymond Chow is a good man," Chung continued, "but Golden Harvest is a young company. It does not have the infrastructure, the distribution, the protection that a career like yours will require. The bigger you become, the more attention you attract. Not all of that attention will be friendly. You will need people who can manage the landscape around you, people who understand how things work in this city." Bruce picked up his teacup. He held it for a moment without drinking. Then he set it down and said, "I appreciate the concern, but I have always managed my own landscape." The table went quiet, not the kind of quiet that follows a joke no one laughed at, the kind of quiet that follows a line being drawn. Chung smiled. It was a small smile, tight at the corners, the kind of smile that does not involve the eyes. "Of course," he said, "I would expect nothing less from a man like you, but managing your own landscape and understanding the full terrain are not the same thing. There are considerations in this business that exist beyond the camera, beyond the contract, considerations that, if misunderstood, can make even the brightest star go dark very quickly." It was not a threat. Not exactly. It was something worse than a threat. It was an education. And the lesson was this: you are not as free as you think you are. Bruce Lee had heard versions of this speech before, in Hollywood, from producers who told him an Asian man could never lead a film, from casting directors who wanted him to play waiters and laundry workers, from studio executives who looked through him as though he were furniture. He had heard the speech of powerful men explaining to less powerful men why the world was shaped the way it was, and why it could not be reshaped. He had never accepted it. But here, in this room, on the third floor of a building with no sign and no handle on the door, the speech carried a different weight, because the men delivering it did not operate within the law. They operated alongside it, above it, and occasionally beneath it. And the man in the grey suit at the end of the table had not moved, had not spoken, had not blinked, and that stillness was the loudest thing in the room. Yuen cleared the second course. His hands were steady, but inside his chest, something was turning. A knot he had kept tied for 13 years was beginning to loosen, because he had seen rooms like this before, rooms where the food was a prelude and the conversation was a cage, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent his life in proximity to violence, that this evening was not going to end with dessert. What Yuen did not yet know was exactly what role he would play in what came next, whether he would remain what he had been for 13 years, a man who carried trays and said nothing, or whether the ghost of who he used to be, the boxer, the fighter, the man with 29 knockouts, would rise from the place where he had buried it and make a decision that could not be taken back. That decision was less than 40 minutes away. The third course arrived at 8:25, braised abalone with shiitake mushrooms. Yuen carried the platter from the kitchen with both hands, and as he approached the table, he noticed that the arrangement of the room had changed. Not physically, the chairs were in the same positions, the men were seated in the same order, but the geometry of attention had shifted. When the dinner began, every man at the table had been oriented toward Chung. Now, imperceptibly, they were oriented toward Bruce, not out of respect, out of assessment. Ko-Wyman, the talent manager, had moved his chair half an inch closer to the table. The bodyguard Lam had uncrossed his arms. The two Pacific Crown associates had stopped eating. And the man in the grey suit at the end of the table had done something he had not done all evening. He had leaned forward. Bruce Lee noticed all of this. Yuen was certain of it. Because Bruce's posture had changed too. Not tensed, not coiled. Something subtler than that. He had become more still. The way water becomes still before it freezes. There was no agitation in his body, no fidgeting, no adjustment. He simply occupied his chair with a completeness that made the air around him feel denser. Chung continued speaking. His voice had not changed in pitch or volume, but the pauses between his sentences had grown longer, and each pause was filled with a kind of weight that pressed on the room like humidity. "Bruce, let me be more direct," Chung said. "I did not invite you here to give you advice. I invited you here to offer you a partnership. Pacific Crown would like to co-produce your next 3 films. We bring financing, distribution across Southeast Asia, and certain protections that I think you will find valuable. In return, we take a percentage, a fair one, and we have input on certain decisions, casting, locations, release dates, nothing that would compromise your art, simply a structure." Bruce looked at Chung for a long moment. Then he looked at each man at the table, one at a time, moving clockwise. He did not rush. He gave each face 3 full seconds of attention. When he reached the man in the grey suit, he held his gaze for 5 seconds. The man in the grey suit did not look away. Neither did Bruce. Then Bruce spoke. "I understand what you are offering, and I understand what you are not saying. Let me be equally direct. I did not come to Hong Kong to make films within someone else's structure. I came to Hong Kong to make my films, mine. If that creates a problem for your landscape, then we have a problem, but it will be your problem, not mine." The silence that followed was not measured in seconds, it was measured in heartbeats. Yuen, standing near the kitchen doorway with an empty tray pressed against his chest, counted 7 of his own before anyone moved. Chung placed both hands flat on the table. He looked at Bruce with an expression that was not anger. It was closer to disappointment. The disappointment of a man who has offered a reasonable arrangement and has been told, in the most polite and absolute terms, no. "I see," Chung said. "Then I must tell you something, and I say this not as a threat, but as a statement of how things are. There are men in this city who have invested in the current order of things. Studios, theaters, distribution channels, all of it. They have invested money, relationships, and loyalty. When someone arrives from outside that order and disrupts it, those men do not ask for a meeting. They do not send red envelopes. They solve the problem directly. I am the man who sends the red envelope, Bruce. I am the meeting before the problem, and you are making it very difficult for me to help you. Bruce stood up. He did not push back his chair. He simply rose, the way a spring uncoils, and he was standing before anyone at the table had processed the motion. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall, and in that moment, standing in a room full of men who controlled money and violence and territory, he appeared to be the tallest person in the building. "Thank you for dinner," Bruce said. "The garupa was excellent." He turned toward the door, and that is when Lam, the bodyguard, stood up. Lam was not a subtle man. He had spent 8 years as a constable in the Yau Ma Tei district before being dismissed for excessive force during an arrest. He had been working private security for Pacific Crown for 3 years. He was accustomed to being the largest person in any room, and he was accustomed to that size meaning something. When Chung nodded, almost imperceptibly, Lam interpreted it the way he interpreted most of Chung's signals, as permission. He stepped between Bruce and the door. "Sit down," Lam said. Bruce did not sit down. He did not step back. He did not change his expression. He looked at Lam the way a man looks at a math problem he has already solved in his head but has not yet written on the board. "Move," Bruce said. One word, flat, without inflection. Lam did not move. Instead, he placed one hand on Bruce's shoulder. What happened in the next 3 seconds would later be described by Kowloon, the only person in the room who ever spoke about that night, as the single most frightening thing he had ever witnessed. Not because of the violence, because of the economy of it. Bruce did not throw a punch. He redirected. He took Lam's wrist with his left hand, rotated his own body 45 degrees to the left, and delivered a single strike with the heel of his right palm to the center of Lam's chest. The strike was not theatrical. There was no wind-up, no grunt, no sound at all except a short, dense thud, like someone dropping a sandbag onto concrete from a height of 2 feet. Lam went backward, not stumbling, not staggering. His feet left the ground, both of them. For approximately 1 second, a 230-pound man was airborne, and then he was not. He landed against the wall, cracking the plaster where his upper back made contact, and slid down to a seated position on the floor. His mouth was open, his eyes were wide. He was conscious, but he was not breathing correctly. His diaphragm had seized. He looked like a man who had been hit by something he did not see, which, in a meaningful sense, he had. The room froze. The 2 Pacific Crown associates were halfway out of their chairs, their hands braced on the table, unsure whether to move forward or remain still. Kowloon had pressed himself against the back of his chair so hard that the leather was creaking. Chung had not moved. His hands were still flat on the table. His expression had not changed, but his pupils had dilated, and Yuen, who had spent decades reading the faces of men in violent situations, knew what dilated pupils meant. It meant the calculation had changed. The man in the grey suit was still leaning forward, still watching, still silent. Bruce lowered his hand. He looked at Chung. "I will see myself out," he said. He stepped over Lam's extended legs and walked toward the steel door. Yuen watched him go. And in that moment, standing in the amber-lit room with the smell of sandalwood and the sound of Lam gasping for breath, Yuen felt the knot in his chest come fully loose. Not because he wanted to fight. He had buried that part of himself and he intended to keep it buried, but because he understood something that no one else in that room had yet grasped. Bruce Lee had won the moment, but he had not won the evening, because Chung Yat-fai was not the kind of man who absorbed a humiliation in front of his associates and responded with silence. Chung was the kind of man who responded with a phone call, and the phone call would come tonight, and whatever followed the phone call would not happen in a private dining room with 12 chairs and a white tablecloth. It would happen somewhere else, somewhere without witnesses. Yuen put his tray down on the kitchen counter. He untied his apron, and for the first time in 13 years, he made a decision that had nothing to do with carrying plates. He followed Bruce Lee out the door. The staircase at the rear of the Golden Peony was narrow, unlit, and smelled of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. Yuen descended quickly, his restaurant shoes slapping against the steps, his breath short not from effort but from the sudden awareness of what he was doing. He had no plan. He had not thought past the act of removing his apron and walking through the steel door. He was operating on something older than thought, something that lived in the body rather than the mind, a current that had been dammed for 13 years and had now broken through. He reached the ground floor and pushed through the back exit into the alley behind Sai Yung Choi Street. The air hit him. October in Mong Kok, warm, wet, thick with the smell of fried garlic from a Dai Pai Dong around the corner and the exhaust from 1,000 idling engines. Neon bled across the puddles in pink and green and white. The street was alive the way Mong Kok was always alive at night, dense with pedestrians, stall vendors shouting prices, radios playing Cantonese opera from open windows above. Bruce Lee was 30 meters ahead, walking south toward Nathan Road. He moved quickly but without urgency. His hands were loose at his sides. He did not look back. Yuen followed. He did not call out. He did not run. He walked at a pace that kept him within visual range while maintaining enough distance to appear, to any observer, like simply another man heading in the same direction. He passed a newsstand displaying tomorrow's morning papers. The front page of the South China Morning Post carried a photograph of Bruce Lee at the premiere of The Big Boss. The headline read, "Kung Fu Star Breaks All Records." Yuen glanced at it and kept moving. At Nathan Road, Bruce turned left, heading toward the Star Ferry Pier. Yuen followed. The crowds thickened, bodies pressed between the neon storefronts and the double-decker buses grinding along the road. Yuen lost sight of Bruce for 8 seconds near the Jordan Road intersection and felt a spike of panic in his sternum. Then the crowd parted, and he saw the black cotton shirt again, 20 meters ahead, moving with a fluidity that made the people around him look mechanical by comparison. Bruce stopped. He stopped at the entrance to a narrow lane between a tailor shop and a mahjong parlor. The lane was perhaps 2 meters wide and ran about 30 meters deep before terminating at a corrugated metal fence. It was poorly lit. A single bulb hung from a wire above the tailor shop's back door, casting a yellow circle on the wet ground. Beyond that circle, the lane dissolved into shadow. Bruce stood at the entrance to the lane and looked into it. He did not move. He stood the way a man stands when he is considering whether to enter a room he knows he should not enter. Then he took a breath, adjusted his sleeves, and walked in. Yuen reached the lane entrance 12 seconds later. He looked in and saw Bruce standing in the yellow circle of light, his back to the tailor shop wall, and he saw 3 men standing in the shadow beyond the circle. Yuen recognized the formation instantly. He had seen it in the warehouses. 2 men shoulder-width apart in the front, 1 man behind them and slightly to the right. The triangle. It was not a defensive formation. It was a containment formation. The front 2 close the distance. The third prevents retreat to the right. The wall covers the left. The mark has 1 direction to go, and that direction is through. The 2 front men were not large. Medium build, dark clothing, no visible weapons. But they stood with their weight forward, on the balls of their feet, and their hands were not in their pockets. The third man was larger, broader through the shoulders, and he held something at his side that Yuen could not quite see. A pipe, a bat, something rigid. Bruce Lee stood in the light and looked at them. He had not been ambushed. Yuen understood that immediately. Bruce had known they were there. He had seen them, or sensed them, or been told by whatever instinct guided him through rooms and streets and alleyways. He had walked into the lane not because he was unaware, but because he had decided to face it. One of the front men spoke. His voice was low, clipped, the dialect of a man from the New Territories. "Chung sends his regards." Bruce said nothing. "You embarrassed him tonight, in front of his people, in front of someone important. That was a mistake." Bruce still said nothing, but his weight shifted, almost invisibly. His left foot moved approximately 2 inches backward, and his center of gravity dropped by a fraction. To an untrained eye, nothing had changed. To Yuen's eye, everything had changed. Bruce Lee had just loaded himself like a spring, and the spring was now fully compressed. The front men moved. Yuen did not watch what happened next from the entrance of the lane. He watched it from inside the lane, because the moment the first man stepped forward, Yuen's body made a decision that his mind had not authorized. He moved, not toward Bruce, toward the lane's only remaining opening, the entrance behind him. He turned his back to the fight and positioned himself at the mouth of the alley, filling it with his body. He was not blocking the men inside from escaping. He was blocking anyone else from entering, because Yuen knew how Chung operated. Chung did not send 3 men and hope for the best. Chung sent 3 men and kept 2 more around the corner. The cleanup crew, the men who arrived after the initial confrontation to finish what the first wave started, or to ensure that whatever happened in the alley stayed in the alley. Yuen had served men like Chung for decades. He had cleared their plates and filled their glasses and listened to their conversations through kitchen walls. He knew the arithmetic of violence in Hong Kong, and the arithmetic always included a reserve. Yuen stood at the entrance of the lane with his arms at his sides and his flat knuckles visible and his 51-year-old body filling the gap between the tailor shop wall and the mahjong parlor wall, and he waited. Behind him, sounds. A short, sharp exhale, the crack of an impact, a grunt, the scrape of shoes on wet concrete, another impact, deeper, heavier, a gasp, then a sound like something hollow hitting something solid, followed by a clatter, as though the rigid object the third man had been holding was no longer in his hand. Then silence, then breathing, one person's breathing, controlled, slow, deliberate. Yuen did not turn around. 40 seconds passed, 50, a minute, then footsteps coming toward him, stopping. Bruce Lee's voice from directly behind him. "How long have you been standing there?" "Since you walked in," Yuen said. "Why?" Yuen did not answer immediately. He was looking at the street, at the neon, at the buses, at the 1,000 people who had no idea what had just happened 10 meters from where they were buying newspapers and eating fish balls. "Because you tipped me $100, Yuen said. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a man who understood exactly what had just been said and was weighing the full dimension of it. "The Noodle House," Bruce said. "Granville Road." "Yes. You were carrying chrysanthemum tea." "I was carrying jasmine." "But, yes." Bruce Lee stepped around Yuen and stood beside him at the mouth of the alley. His white shirt had a single dark mark on the left sleeve near the elbow. His hands were at his sides. His breathing was normal. Behind them, in the shadows, Yuen could hear the sound of 1 man groaning and 2 men silent. Bruce looked at Yuen, then he looked at his hands, at the flat knuckles. "You did not come in," Bruce said. "No." "Why? You didn't need me in there. You needed me here." Bruce considered this. He looked at the lane entrance. He looked at the street. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has been given a gift he did not expect and cannot easily categorize. "What is your name?" Bruce asked. "Yuen Wah Kung." "Yuen Wah Kung, the boxer." Yuen's chest tightened. "Not anymore. Once a fighter, always a fighter. The knuckles don't lie. You know this." They stood in silence for a moment, 2 men at the edge of an alley in Mong Kok, surrounded by 1,000,000 people who would never know they were there. "Can I walk you to Nathan Road?" Yuen said. "No," Bruce said. "I will walk you." They walked north along Nathan Road, moving against the current of foot traffic. 2 men who appeared to have nothing in common, one famous, one invisible, one who had just incapacitated 3 men in a darkened alley with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. One who had stood at the mouth of that alley and done nothing, and in doing nothing, had done the one thing that mattered. Bruce did not speak for the first 2 blocks. He walked with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, his eyes forward, his pace steady. Yuen walked beside him, half a step behind, the way he had been trained to walk beside customers at the restaurant, present but unimposing. They passed electronics shops still blazing at 9 p.m. They passed a group of teenagers arguing about football scores. They passed an old woman selling roasted chestnuts from a cart, the smoke curling upward into the neon haze. At the corner of Waterloo Road, Bruce stopped. He turned to Yuen and looked at him with an expression that Yuen would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to the one person he ever told this story to. It was not gratitude, it was not pity, it was recognition, the kind of recognition that passes between 2 men who have both lived with violence, who have both been shaped by it and scarred by it, and who understand that the decision to use it or not to use it is the most personal decision a human being can make. "You stood at that entrance because you knew more men were coming," Bruce said. "I thought they might. They would have. If you had not been there, they would have come. 2 more. Chung always sends a second group. I have seen it before. Not here. In the States. Different men. Same structure." "I know," Yuen said. "You know because you have been around men like Chung. I have served men like Chung." "That is not the same as being around them. Serving them means you watched. Watching means you learned. Learning means you knew exactly what to do tonight without anyone telling you. Yuen said nothing. The $100, Bruce said. I did not tip you because I felt sorry for you. I tipped you because when you caught that tea tray, I saw something. Your reflexes, your hands, the way your body moved before your mind could interfere. That is not something you learn. That is something you have, and you have it even now, at your age, after all these years of carrying other people's food. Yuen's eyes burned. He blinked once. He looked at the ground. I killed a man, Yuen said. The words came out before he could stop them. He had not spoken them in 13 years. He had not spoken them to his wife. He had not spoken them to the priest at the church on Austin Road where he sat in the back pew every Sunday morning. He spoke them now on a street corner in Kowloon to a man he had met twice. In a fight? Bruce asked. In a fight? An accident? I hit him too hard. He fell wrong. He died. Bruce looked at Yuen for a long time. The neon cycled through its colors. A bus hissed to a stop behind them and hissed away again. That is why you stopped, Bruce said. Yes, and tonight you started again. Yuen shook his head. I did not fight tonight. I stood at a doorway. Standing at that doorway was the hardest fight you have had in 13 years, and you won it. Yuen did not know what to say to that. He was a man who had spent the majority of his adult life saying nothing of consequence, nodding at customers, apologizing for delays, thanking people for tips he would use to buy rice and bus fare. And now the most famous man in Hong Kong was telling him that standing still in an alleyway was a victory. Bruce reached into his pocket and took out a business card. It was simple, white cardstock. His name in English on one side, Chinese on the other, a phone number, a Cumberland Road address. If you ever need anything, Bruce said, call this number. Yuen took the card. He held it the way he had held the $100 bill 3 weeks earlier, with both hands, as though it was something that might dissolve if handled carelessly. I do not need anything, Yuen said. Everyone needs something. What do you need? Bruce smiled. It was a real smile, not the one he gave to cameras, not the one he gave to reporters or producers or the men at the dinner table. A real one, small, brief, like a match flaring in a dark room. I need to know that kindness travels, Bruce said. That when you give something to the world, it does not disappear. That it moves. That it finds its way back to you, sometimes in a form you do not recognize, sometimes carried by a person you spoke to for 40 seconds in a noodle house on Granville Road. I need to know that. Because if that is not true, then nothing I am building matters. They stood at the corner for another moment. Then Bruce Lee extended his hand. Yuen shook it. Bruce's grip was firm but not aggressive. It was the handshake of a man who had nothing to prove. Go home, Yuen Wah Kung, Bruce said. Get some rest and do not go back to the Golden Peony. I was not planning to. Bruce nodded. He turned south and walked into the crowd. Within seconds, he was gone, absorbed by the city, one man among millions. Yuen stood on the corner for 4 more minutes. He looked at the business card. He read the name. He turned it over and read it again. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in his shirt pocket beside the $100 bill he still had not spent, and walked home. He never called the number. He never went back to the Golden Peony. He never saw Bruce Lee again. But for the remaining 43 years of his life, Yuen Wah Kung carried 2 things in every shirt he owned: a folded $100 bill and a white business card with a Cumberland Road address. He never spent the money. He never made the call, but he carried them every single day because they were proof of something that most people go their entire lives without experiencing. Proof that a single moment of being seen by the right person at the right time can change the entire direction of a life. Not because of what is given, but because of what is remembered. And what is remembered is not the money, it is not the card, it is the 40 seconds in a noodle house when a man in a black shirt looked at another man's broken knuckles and said, "You used to fight," and in those 3 words acknowledged everything that had been lost and everything that still remained. That is the story of the $100 tip. Not a story about Bruce Lee winning a fight. He won many of those. This is a story about what happened because he left a tip. Because kindness, unlike violence, does not end when the moment ends. It echoes, it circles, it finds its way into alleys and doorways and the hands of men who thought they had nothing left to give. And sometimes just sometimes, it saves your life.